Hi everyone, welcome back to the second Myanmar session of the day. It's really good to have more of you here again to listen to some of our findings. In this second session, we're going to explore the relationship between drugs development and conflict dynamics by focusing in specifically on the small city of Muse, which sits on the Myanmar-China border in northern SHAN state. And the aim of this session, like in the parallel sessions with Colombia and Afghanistan, is to provide a spatial history, or what we've called in this project a Borderland biography, of Muse to show some of the relationships around drugs development and conflict and how they are all embedded and the relationships that surround them in this particular space. We're going to divide this presentation between three speakers, so myself, and also Sayong La and Sai Kampu of the SHAN team. And I'm going to begin by outlining first what we actually mean by a Borderland biography and why we have focused on Muse for today's presentation. Next slide, please. And next one as well, please. Okay, so the idea of setting out this a notion of Borderland biographies is to try to place drug issues within their wider social, political and economic context in the areas in which they are produced and consumed. And this is in response to a tendency in which drugs are often treated as though they are exceptional, that there is a tendency to link drugs with inherent attributes, whether that is engendering crime, violence, state fragility or state absence, and a lack of economic development. And this is often also meant in methodological terms, in terms of projects focusing on drug issues, asking quite direct and narrow questions, whether that is around prices for drugs, drug trafficking networks, rather than trying to situate drugs within wider questions around power structures, livelihoods, belief systems within which drugs are produced and consumed. So in contrast to this, the Borderland biography is an attempt to try to situate drugs within this broader socio-economic and political milieu in which they are common. And there's a number of aspects to this. I think particularly important is this idea of a relational framework to understand how drugs have shaped but also been shaped by wider processes at work in the borderland regions that we're exploring, whether that is wider processes of state formation, agrarian change, armed conflict, violence, and trade. And it's also an attempt to try to engage much more substantively with marginalized voices, that in many ways these borderland biographies are directly drawing upon so many of the fieldwork interviews that we've conducted in Muse. Which is research that has been conducted both by the SHAN team and the KRC team. Next slide, please. And we've chosen to focus on Muse in particular as the focus for this Borderland biography, because it's a region that has undergone huge transformation since the late 1980s. And today it has become one of the country's most important borderland development zones and handles more than 80% of legal overland trade between China and Myanmar. So although it may seem peripheral when looking at a map of Myanmar and kind of located far to the north, it's actually of huge strategic economic importance to the national economy. It's also become a key border hub within wider development strategies across the region, most notably the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, which forms a key part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And at the same time as all of this, it also remains an area that is subject to ongoing violence, protracted instability and conflict, and therefore provides a really powerful window into some of the wider issues that we've been dealing with in this project across SHAN State and Kachin State more broadly. And the key aims within this are to try to understand how drugs have become embedded within this wider story of change in Muse, focusing primarily on the region, like I said, since the late 1980s. Next slide, please. And through this, the aim is to try to begin to unpack a number of key questions. So the first of these is how and why have illicit drug economies become entangled in development processes, systems of rule, and everyday life in places like Muse? What kinds of illicit border worlds have been constructed at the margins, and how and why do these vary across contexts and time? And another key issue that we'll come to in the conclusion of today's presentation is also trying to unpack a little bit who are the beneficiaries and who loses out from the way in which illegal drug economies have become embedded in wider processes of change. And also then what new insights does this provide into understandings of illicit drug economies, as well as issues of conflict and development more broadly. Next slide, please. And in terms of the structure of today's presentation, we're going to begin by initially trying to provide a brief overview of Muse to try to give a feel of what this city is like and its importance. I'm then going to pass over to Sayong La, who is then going to provide some reflections on what the governance structures of Muse look like. How is this city governed? Who are the local authorities in charge? And what is their relationship with drugs? We're then going to look in part 3 at some of the issues around Muse's economic development and how the drug economy is inextricably linked with the legal economy in places like Muse. And then in part 4, I'm going to pass over to Sai Kampu in the SHAN team, who is going to reflect on some of the issues around everyday life in Muse. So what do these issues around governance and development look like for people in their everyday lives, in terms of how they navigate violence, informality, and illegality? And then we'll round off with a set of final conclusions. Next slide, please. And the next one as well. So the Muse sits on the Myanmar-China border in northern Shan state. And just across the border in China is the China border city of Ruli. And these paired border towns have long been an important overland gateway between the two countries. And this was very much the case historically, where a key road connecting the two countries passed through Muse. However, for much of the period since Myanmar's independence in 1948 until the late 1980s, the Myanmar-China border was much more closed. If we move on to the next slide, please. So on the China side, Yunnan's border with Myanmar was officially sealed by Chairman Mao as part of a centralization strategy aimed at directing the province inwards. So although there were a whole array of informal and officially illegal border crossings, in terms of actual state-to-state relations between these two countries, the border was much more closed. And in Myanmar, for a lot of the kind of decades after independence, large areas of the borderland were controlled by opposition ethnic armed organizations. And equally, much of the country's economic strategy was primarily focused on trying to generate revenue through large agricultural surpluses, which were primarily focused on the Delta region and the center of the country, in particular rice production. And whereas the government's focus in borderland areas was much more on trying to tackle insurgency and part of these ongoing protracted armed conflicts that shaped this borderland region for so many decades. Next slide, please. So the Communist Party of Burma was the largest and most powerful of the armed groups that operated across northern Shan state, and had been was a key part of Muse's history. However, through the 1980s, 3 key factors began to change the dynamics along the Myanmar-China border. Next slide, please. The first of these was that the conflict dynamics across northern Shan state underwent a significant shift in the late 1980s. The Myanmar army recorded a number of military victories against ethnic armed organizations in Muse Township through the mid-1980s, which gradually enabled it to strengthen its control over this highly strategic region of the border. The Myanmar military government also changed its approach towards the country's restive borderlands and reached an array of ceasefire agreements with various armed organizations which were active in Kachin state and northern Shan state. And these changing dynamics brought a fragile stability to northern Shan state. And Muse became the one border crossing with China that was under direct government control. The second key factor that facilitated the emergence of Muse as a key development zone after 1988 was the central Myanmar government's changing economic strategy. In an attempt to try to strengthen the national economy, which had been close to bankruptcy by the late 1980s, the military government increasingly looked to cross-border trade and also the large amounts of natural resources that were contained in Myanmar's borders as a way to kickstart the economy. So the government legalized border trade through government-controlled gates in 1988 and also passed new land laws and foreign investment laws as a way of trying to encourage foreign investment into borderland regions. And this set off highly much more intense processes of resource extraction, especially around logging, mining, also large-scale infrastructure around dam building, the construction of oil and gas pipelines, which also passed through Muse. And one of the most important infrastructure projects of this period was improvements to the road that linked Muse on the China border to Mandalay. That previously this trip could take, as long as a couple of days, or even records of up to 7 days during the rainy season to make this trip, whereas the improved road brought this down to around 12 to 15 hours. So suddenly made the border and relations across into China much more accessible to central Myanmar. And the next few slides just try to capture some of these changes that were experienced through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. So if we just run through the next set of picture slides. Keep going. So this is the Asia World Company toll bridge on that main road. And this gives a sense of some of the extent of the border trade that now passes through Muse along this road. Okay, and then if we stop at this slide, the third key change that shifted Muse's political economy came from the China side. That whereas, like I said, under Chairman Mao, there'd been a primary focus on trying to pressurize border provinces within China to direct their attentions inwards to central China. By the late 1980s, there were growing concerns within China at the growing economic disparity across China. That whereas a lot of the Chinese economic miracle had been based on coastal provinces, a lot of the interior landlocked provinces in the west of China had experienced much slower levels of economic growth and development. And cross-border trade, especially with Southeast Asia, came to be seen as a potential antidote to some of this. And this also led to growing interest in trying to promote cross-border trade and economic integration, in which Muse was perfectly placed and was well situated for this. Next couple of slides, please. So this is the main border gate between China and Muse. And this is now the Ruli skyline. So you can see that Ruli has now become a quite sizable city on the China side of the border. And if we now look at Muse's economic importance today, these graphs are a little bit out of date. I think they date back to the mid-2000s. Whereas now Muse is by far the largest of all of the overland border crossings between Myanmar and its neighbours, and accounts for the vast majority of revenues that are generated from cross-border trade between Myanmar and China. Next slide, please. However, what is striking about Muse is that on the one hand, it has become this hugely important economic node between China and Myanmar, and has become pivotal to the cross-border trade routes and the revenue that is generated from this, and has become a key linchpin in the national economy, especially for Myanmar, but also importantly for Yunnan province and some of the rapid economic development that has been experienced there. Yet at the same time as it has developed this increasing economic and strategic importance, it remains a highly kind of fragile state with a huge array of overlapping authorities. That this is not a town that has come under clear centralized Myanmar army control, but is home to an array of business activities and political activities by all sorts of armed organizations, including ethnic armed organizations which have business interests in the town, but also an array of army-backed militia groups. And what you've seen is that over this period, despite the huge amount of trade that passes through the city, there's also been flare-ups of significant violence that has often shut down cross-border trade or has led to loss of life within the city and also on the main roads that link the city to central Myanmar. So you see this tension that you have this rapid economic development within Muse overlapping onto a long-standing unresolved armed conflict in northern Shan state. And that this has created huge pressures to try to maintain stability and order to keep flows of commodities, people and capital moving through this border. And this has brought a whole complex set of actors, interests and processes into Muse's recent history, to try to kind of, and these have become integral to shaping the dynamics within the city itself. So if we move through the next couple of slides, these just give a sense of some of the ongoing insecurity. So I'm sorry, this map's not very clear, but the colors on the map indicate different areas of territorial control amongst different armed organizations. So you can see Muse is nestled between this highly fragmented region of northern Shan state. Next slide, please. These just give some of the indications of some of the ongoing insecurities and conflict that take place in this region. Next slide, please. Yeah, and one more. And just to give a very brief example of this before I pass over to Saul, who will talk in a little bit more detail, to give a sense of the complexity of the kind of fragmented authority within this region, I wanted to quickly give the example of cross-border cattle trading. So over recent decades, cross-border cattle trading from Myanmar into China has become a booming business, although one that was predominantly illegal until 2017. And the main kind of cattle rearing heartlands of Myanmar in the center of the country, in particular in Mandalay and Sagaing division. And yet, as soon as this cattle begins to move towards the China border, it moves through a whole series of checkpoints that are an array of different ethnic armed organizations, militias, Myanmar army and police, all extract revenue from this trade. So as soon as this trade moves through Pinyu Luin, which is still hundreds of miles from the China border, these various groups begin to kind of extract taxes and revenue from this trade. And at Kutkai, which links back to the previous presentation, if you think back to Dan Seng Long's talk about the Kongka militia based in Kutkai, they've also become instrumental to this cattle trading route, providing large grazing areas and effectively holding pens for a lot of this cattle before it is then moved up to Muse and transported across the border. And again, once this cattle trade then reaches the border at Muse, again, it is subject to various kind of fees that have to be paid to government authorities in order to cross into the country. And in 2007, up until 2017, most of this trade had been illegal and had passed through kind of all of this process under the radar. Whereas in 2017, the Myanmar government moved to legalize cattle exports. And part of the logic of this was to try to move this quite lucrative trade out of the hands of ethnic armed organizations and to move it through more formal government channels as a way of trying to increase government revenues through this. And I don't really have time to dwell on this now, but it's something that KRC have written a lot more on. What has become striking in recent years is that with COVID-19 and with the shutting of the border, a lot of the illegal cattle trading routes that were important prior to 2017 have become much more important again, as this cross-border cattle trade has remained important, but is now increasingly going through illegal trading networks rather than the formal border crossings that have been shut as a result of COVID. So I'm now going to pass over to Sayong La, who is going to provide some reflections on the kinds of public authorities that govern Muse. If you just bear with me for 1 second, we've got the same technical issues as we had in the first time, so I just need to call him on an app, and he will then speak through that through my computer. So just give me 1 second while I set that up. Okay, we've got that set up now. So if we move on to the next slide, and yeah, I'm now going to pass over to Sayong La. Yeah, it's all set up now.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. So I'm going to talk more detail about like how the militias play a very key, role as a key, governance fix in this borderlands regions. Next slide, please. Okay, yeah, like Patrick just talked about, yeah, we see, like despite Buse's position as a key overland gateway to China, it is still striking, like still governed by very complex and fragmented, that is necessary to the formal and informal actor. And also, like Muse is still not under a system of consolidated and also like central state control. And it is very significant, featuring Muse is that there's also like Muse is an area that is a lot of militias are presenting. According to our few research, there are maybe more than 10, powerful militia groups are active in this area, and actually, they are locally known as Bidusit in Burmese language, which means that they are the people militias, but the way they act maybe can also not really represent the people. And actually this group also like epitomize what a famous Danish scholar called Christian Lund has termed this group as a twilight institutions, which means these militia groups are not the state, but they exercise the way they exercise the public authority. So this militia, many of them, they have their foundations in the region insurgency politics. They play, a number of important roles in governing, the space, also like the population in this area, as well as, the flow of capitals and trades in Muse. And they operate checkpoints, more oftenly alongside or on behalf of the army. They operate the checkpoint is police, and also they tax the goods and the people who are entering and leaving the city. And they also provide the coercive measure of various form of dispossessions within the city. And also like this also on behalf of both the army and also like the private investor or companies. Yeah, most of them they are from the Chinese. From the Chinese investor or business men. And at the same time, this Malaysia they also like act as a business broker. You know, they also like they connect between the investor, you know, and also like the companies, and yeah, most of them as they, you know, they're located on the China border. Most of like the investor are from China, but we also like can see like okay, like the Chinese, Burmese Chinese people that also operate, you know, their business in this area. Next slide, please. Maybe this is. This is the one of the military checkpoints, you know, in the Muse city that they also like I said, they tax the goods and the people who entering this area. And this Malaysia they play a very important role in the Muse economy. Their business interests, including, you know, like gas stations, also like cement factory, also like water factory, bus company, also like import and export business, and more importantly is the casinos, and also like the most of them they are also involved in the illegal drugs trafficking and production. And you will see like maybe next slide, like the pictures of like this. This is the gas stations on the main road to Muse cities. Also like these gas stations are owned by, you know, powerful militia groups, you know. So this Malaysia also like operates within previous economic space in Muse, you know. In many ways, you know, they represent working in a kind of, you know, de facto spatial economic zone, you know. They are also, you know, able to operate within kind of like minimal state interference, you know. They can also like obtain, you know, the official licenses. They sometimes, you know, or even most of the time, they can operate the business without needing, you know, to get a license. Or even they don't even sometimes they don't pay the tax to the state government. So this economic activities, you know, have enabled them to kind of be self-financing and also reducing pressure on the military budgets, you know, and also like the economic concessions have also provide a way for the Myanmar army, you know, to try to secure and also like maintain the loyalty with this group, you know. And they are doing this because they want to prevent them from kind of returning, you know, to join maybe like insurgency, or because of some of them they are also like the splinter from the any armed organization, so to prevent them joining their kind of former any armed organizations. And also like this, Malaysia themselves, they also sought to kind of maintain relationship with the army. Often, you know, most of the time, you know, their relationship is throughout like kind of like the system of informal payments, you know. So for them, they are doing this because like they want to retain kind of business opportunity, protection, and also like the impunity. Next slide. Just to see like this militia. They have like their members, like their soldiers, you know, also like active in the city, and as you can see, you know, they have a very kind of very professional equipment, you know, along with them, even like they're going around in the city like that. So therefore this kind of like system, you know, enable the Myanmar military, you know, to generate income, you know, maybe for both private gain and also like for the military budgets, you know, And also like this income mainly come from, like I said, from the illicit or the gray activity, such as from the casino and from the drug trade, drug business. And also like at the same time, the Myanmar military also like trying to maintain, kind of a level of, official separation from these activities, this is a way that they, they try to avoid not to kind of like directly involved in kind of this Malaysia kind of illicit, illicit business. Yeah. So we can say that the role of this Malaysia, that have been shaping this Muse, Muse development also like extend kind of far beyond this, this boundary. They have like kind of secure the territory around this, around the key trade routes, and also like around the site of kind of resource extraction. Most of the time, they're doing this alongside with the Myanmar army. And also like these activities have played a very important part in helping, to ensure, the kind of the continued flow of goods, throughout, Muse. And with this kind of business activity, in return, this Malaysia they does support the army effort to secure this territory. Sometimes it's more far in the kind of in the remote area. So they got the like I said, they're rewarded by gaining the economic opportunity, and then Muse also like become kind of a very kind of in one hand they are also like a current, to how can I say to use as a coalition building, and also like deal making, with the Myanmar military state effort, to kind of stabilize and also like secure control in this area. And therefore, this military Malaysian networks, across SHAN state have, a significant, very significant role in the political economics in Mose. And also like most important, this has, enabled a certain form of informal Malaysia governance, and also like the illegality to become kind of very deeply entrenched in the kind of political and economic foundation in this area. And next slide, please. Before this is the table of the kind of the powerful Malaysia groups that is active in this area, in Muse area. And this I'm going to maybe because of the time, just talk about one of the group, that playing a kind of very significant role in this area is the Banse Malaysia. Actually this Banse Malaysia groups are very kind of a very powerful group, Also, like their leaders are kind of a very trustful, trusted person to the Myanmar military since 1980s. At the time of their emerging in this area. Actually, this group are originally from Nam Kham Township, which is the township next to Muse Township. However, they are kind of since 1980s. This group become, gradually become one of the most powerful in this area, and they have a lot of business, including licit and illicit business in the area, and and also like we said, also like also the leaders is not like the SHAN person, not the any SHAN. This person, this leader is the kind of like Lisu Chinese, Annex person, and seeing they are kind of emerging in this area because of they have a very tight relationship with the army. Most of the time, it has been reported that this group also like fights, alongside with the armies, to against with the other kind of any armed organizations, and that is how they gain kind of economic opportunity to operate, like I mentioned, around doing various kind of border crossing business, like jet business, secret factory, gas station, and also casinos, and very important business is they are involving in the drug business. And however, this group, like the leaders, in 2010 has become an MP, and he was kind of a member of the military-backed political parties. And in 2010, this man become an MP, represents a constitution in Nakham, in Shan State Parliament. So we can see like this how this militia, they develop, and also like trying to find a space in in the democratic transition. How they're trying to kind of embedded in a more kind of open the politics, the new kind of politics. However, their involvement in all this business are still kind of very powerful, and they are very active, and in kind of governance in this area. I think I will end here, and I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Saul. Okay, so if we just move through a couple of the slides, because there's a bit more detail in the table here, and carry on to the next slide. This is just a photo of one of the Pansay militias. So in the next part, I'm just going to very briefly talk about how drugs have also become embedded in Muse's development, before I then pass over to Sai Kampu to talk a little bit more about what this looks like in terms of everyday life. So next slide, please. So in terms of the relationship between how drugs and Muse's wider development, there's a number of key relationships that emerged out of our work. The first of these is that all of these complex governance structures that Sai Aung La has just been talking about in terms of army-backed militias and their relationships with the military, it's clear that opportunities to be involved in illegal economies, whether that's drugs, resources, or other grey issues like casinos, have been a key part of trying to cement the relationships between militias and the military. And has also been a way of trying to maintain their loyalty, and that their involvement in illegal economies remains reliant on maintaining kind of good relationships with the military. The other key aspect of this is that it also means that a lot of the revenues that are generated from these illicit economies, again, whether that's drugs or casinos or other aspects, also then often flow into government funding as well, whether that's the army, the police, or local government departments, that a lot of these kind of informal networks are lubricated with backhanders, payoffs, deals, and a lot of this revenue is generated from the illegal economy. And also drugs are a key part of the literal making of Muse, that if you think of where does a lot of this money get invested? It's in those kind of gas stations, cement factories, water factories, hotels, casinos, real estate developments. So if you look at the expansion and the growth of Muse as a city over the past few decades, illegal drug revenues have become a key part of that story, and helps to show how drugs have become kind of so embedded within the economy. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of one of the drug halls. One more slide. So I'm now going to pass over to Sai Kampu in the SHAN team, who is going to reflect a little bit more on what everyday life looks like in Muse around this wider context of forms of illegality, drugs, and informal public authorities that govern the city. So I'll pass over to you, Pumung.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pat. Next slide, please. I'm going to present about the everyday life in Muse, and as Dr. Pat and Sai Aung has present about how the complex and very contested by the militias and ethnic armed group in Muse. So that when there are many ethnic armed groups and also militias and very powerful, and but why the civilians or the peoples have no powers, and so that the people navigate or negotiate to survive and living in a kind of very vulnerable and violent place. And so the people they have their own tactics, and if we look at in Muse, because of as the borderlands sharing the border with China, and also many militias group and ethnic, and also when there is violence, and the people have to find their own tactic to deal with this, because of as you can see that at the borderland there are casino, drug, and so on. It's kind of like no rule of law. When there is a gambling and disputes among the gamblers, they came out of the building and shootings one another's, and also the militia shooting the police, or the gambler shooting the police shooting the gambler, and so on. It's just quite very violent. And when the people they have the disputes with the militias and also the powerful group, they cannot fight, or they cannot against with this kind of the militia or the powerful group. And very often when they have the dispute with the militias, they got intimidation by the militia or powerful group, that would you take the money or will you take the bullet to end the case? That kind of intimidations and put on the people. And so the people, the young people, they have no choice but have to live and coping with the violent situation. And so that some young people, some young men, because they have been a kind of living with violence, they also have to find out their own tactic. The young men choose to join the militia so that they can hold the guns, and not only holding the gun, but also they having the business opportunities also. Next slide, please. And this is the quote of the young man. He revealed that his uncles, before he used drug and was arrested by the authority and put in jails and long-term jails. After he got released from the prisons, and then he has the land disputes with the militias, so that he couldn't fight, or he couldn't find the solution with the militia. So that he joined the militias and build his strength and power, recruit men, and also to protect his interests. And so that after he being a militias and have the strength, and so that he can do the business, also protect his interests. This is the way of the local people find their own tactics. Next slide, please. And also many young men joining the militias not only for the doing the business and also but it's a kind of a tactic that to avoid being recruited by the armed group or the armed organizations in Shan State, especially the SSPP and RCSS, the two main Shan ethnic armed group. If they join the militia, they don't have to be recruited by this armed group that have to go into jungle and very far from the parents. If they being joining the militias, so that they can live in Muse or around the Muse and doing the business. Yeah, that is the choice. Next slide, please. And also, this also the young man revealed that in Muse because of the Muse the transit export and import licit and illicit goods from China, so that there are many trucks lined up to enter China, maybe hundreds or thousands, sometimes maybe 4 or 5 kilos are lined up to export goods to China. But most of the truck, because they have to drive far away from the Mandalay, the centrals, of some part or Shan State, quite a long way to border China, and some they have to drive in day and night, and so that to be alert, some truck driver they use the methamphetamine so that they can drive in long hours. When they enter to China territories, the Chinese often check them, and also if find out the positive, they would find them and also some arrest them, and yeah, this is quite a problem at the Myanmar and China border. Next slide, please. And in Muse, because of in Myanmar economy is very bad, and in the township or in the cities, quite some young people are unemployment, so that they move to the border because they can work and earn Chinese yuan currency, which is higher than the Myanmar currency. They get higher wages, so that they move to work along the border or in Muse. And when they work there, sometimes they can make money. If they cannot make money, they got stressed. If they got stressed, they go to drug. And also that is, because of using drug is a kind of, make them happy. Yeah. And so many young people end up using drug at the borders, in Muse, because drug is very easy. And it's like a fresh market. And people, we can see on the street, or we can see on in the right fields or the outskirts of Muse is a kind of market. We could see the sellers or the drug dealer and the drug user, but no authority go and arrest them. That is quite really severe drug problem there. And even the authority seeing the drug user and drug dealers on the fields. But sometimes the authority turn blind eye. If they don't get the quota that have to work to fulfill the quota by year, they don't do the actions. And if they do the actions, most of the time they just arrest the small scale drug dealers. But most of the time the drug producers and the powerful the drug big traffickers are often at large, never being arrested. And so, if the, drug users or, small drug-related offenses, when they've arrested, it's offense long-term, or long-term jails or put in prisons, which is, next slide, please. And this was, I mentioned that, a young man, when he was young, he had to make money or earn money to feed his family. And so that he worked at a gambling, at a gambling. He said that at a gambling, when there's a gambling, there's a drug, it's just a tentatively, kind of correlated. And so when he worked at the gambling longer, then he used drug, and when he got addict, later on he got addict, and he was elected, when he was elected, and because he was shot by the authority, and he was put was put in long-term jails. When he was put in the jails, his daughters still was young. After he got the release from the prison, his daughters, have been graduate because it's a long-term person. This story we have been taken from the life story that we interviewed in Muse. If you would like to know in further detail, you can read our, White from the Borderland report. Yeah. Thank you, Pat.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Sai Kampu. Yeah, and just to reiterate what Pumung was saying there, that extracts from a longer life story that is part of the new Voices from the Borderlands report, which has just been published this week and can be found on our website. Next slide, please. So just to finish off, just before we go into the conclusions, I guess I also wanted to reflect a little bit on the impact of COVID-19 and the military coup. And I think it's important to emphasize that a lot of the research that we conducted in Muse happened before both of these events, that they were work done through 2018 and 2019. But obviously we've kept in touch with people that we interviewed and worked with. And there's a number of key issues that have come out clearly from this. The first of this is that just the huge kind of disruption that has been created by efforts to police the border much more severely, and in some places to close it entirely by the Chinese authorities as a result of COVID-19. And the huge impact this has had on people who are dependent on cross-border trade, and has also increased the importance of illegal cross-border routes in and around Muse, as well as more broadly across the Myanmar-China border. It's also clear that following the military coup, you've had much worsening forms of violence and insecurity across many regions, of which Northern Shan State is one, and that this has created more insecurity, instability and tensions over what was already quite a fractious and fragmented region of the country. And yet at the same time, there are still efforts to try to promote greater economic integration, to still try and push ahead with the kinds of economic development around the Belt and Road Initiative. So you see all of these tensions that have become a key part of Muse's history over the last couple of decades are still very much the same as we look ahead in terms of these ongoing tensions around unresolved conflict, while trying to kind of promote rapid economic growth through this. Next slide, please. So just to finish by way of a number of conclusions, I think the first one to emphasize is to kind of question some of the kind of standard development narratives, which look at drugs primarily through a lens of sort of economic marginality and underdevelopment. And to say that what has happened very clearly here is that you've had processes of economic integration, rapid economic development, but these have not necessarily displaced violence, criminality and illegal drugs. Rather, these have become embedded within those wider development processes. So it requires a more kind of nuanced understanding of the relationship between drugs and development. The second aspect of this is, again, this idea that just because these regions have become more central to the Myanmar state and the Myanmar economy doesn't necessarily equate to them also having kind of become more consolidated or under firmer centralized state control. That the way Muse is governed continues to be through these informal systems of brokerage and negotiations and deal making around a whole array of different public authorities. And what we've seen very clearly in our research around this is that there are clear kind of winners and losers around this process, or the distribution of costs and benefits is very uneven. That what you see in a place like Muse is a small nexus of military, militia and private sector organizations that have benefited significantly from the economic opportunities that have emerged in Muse. But that many of the costs that have come around this, whether that's the environmental degradation, which we haven't talked about much today, or the issues around violence and illegal drug issues, which we have talked about much more, those issues have been felt much more by communities more broadly. So you've had new forms of enrichment concentrated in the hands of small kind of military and private sector elites, and much wider forms of vulnerability and insecurity which have affected the population as a whole. And I think in many ways, what you've seen in Muse over the last couple of decades, in many ways foreshadows the wider experiences of Myanmar's militarized market economy that has emerged over the last decade. That in many ways, these experiments with economic liberalization, moves towards a market economy that you saw in the borderlands and in Muse, now epitomize what were some of the wider experiences of economic development across much of Myanmar as a whole. And I think this reflects one of the key themes in our project, which is emphasizing that the insights that the margins can help us with, that by looking at processes of development from the vantage point of the borderlands actually helps to kind of provide an insight into much bigger processes and dynamics of change at work. And we will finish there. I'm afraid we've gone over time a little bit, although there weren't actually any questions coming into the Q&A box. We've only really got a couple of minutes before we move back to the final kind of recap of the day on the main stage. If anybody does have any final questions, you're very welcome to kind of voice them or to put them in the chat. And if we don't have time to answer them now, we'll follow up with you. But if there aren't any questions, I'll just say a big thank you to the other presenters, Sayongla and Saipu Murng, and we'll move back over to the main stage for the final part of today's conference. I mean, we've just got the announcement come up actually. So yeah, I think we'll finish here. If you do have any questions, you can find all of our kind of contact details on around the conference. There's a final question just come in here around how did the Chinese pipeline project affect the conflict in northern Shan state? I guess the point to emphasize here, which links to some of the broader points we've been making, I guess, is that it's created a huge emphasis on the need to try to maintain stability in these areas. And what you've often seen through this is a willingness to maintain these quite fragmented systems of order between the military, militias and armed organizations that don't really resolve the much deeper political grievances and issues within northern Shan state, but have been a way to try to stabilize the conflict sufficiently so that things like the pipeline and the wider border trade can continue to function. Yeah, so that's a very, very kind of brief answer to that question, but I'll try and follow up with you in more detail around that, because I think it links with a lot of the work we've been doing more broadly. But I think if we finish here, I'll encourage you to move back to the main stage, so if you click on the stage on the left-hand side of your screen, it will take you back to the main stage, which is where we began the conference, and we'll finish here. So yeah, thank you very much to the other presenters. And I'm sorry we overran and kind of ate into the Q&A session.